The weather is cold now, so I've pulled out all my cold weather patterns, including this one, McCalls 8343. I'm sewing view B today with the snap-down yoke in the front pocket. I took a few liberties with the pattern instructions just because it seemed a little bit more intuitive to me. This applies mainly to the front yoke and the collar. I decided to place the pieces together and sew them through all layers, and then finish the seams and top stitch the seams down. This seemed a little bit easier to me, and it gave me a nice clean finish on the inside. I've sewn this pattern twice, both with a stretch fleece material. The material that I'm using in the video today is a butterfly print fleece from Joann Fabric. Let's get busy sewing something warm for the winter. Here we go. Here is the wrong side of my front bodice piece. I'm going to draw myself 5/8 inch stitching lines around these inner corners. We're going to be sewing around these corners about an inch away from the corners on both sides. I'm going to sew along these stitching lines with a standard stitch length. Then we're going to clip from the inner corners to the corner of our stitching line, careful not to clip through the stitching. For the front pocket, we're going to turn these slanted edges to the wrong side along the fold line marked from your pattern piece and give them a press. The pattern instructions tell you to fold this raw edge under by 1/4 inch, and then we're going to top stitch. But because this fleece that I'm using is so thick, I'm just going to trim these seam allowances by half. If you've also trimmed these edges and you're working with a material that will fray, you can finish these edges with a serger or a zigzag stitch. Because the fleece that I'm using does not fray, I'm going to leave them raw. Now I'm going to press them to the wrong side along the crease that we pressed with the iron and pin them in place. And then I'll stitch these slanted edges with about 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then we'll take the pocket back to the ironing board and press the remaining raw edges to the wrong side by 5/8 inch, along the bottom, the sides, and the top. You can tuck the corners to the wrong side by 5/8 inch so that you get a nice clean point as you press in those side edges. And once again, if you're using a material that will fray, go ahead and finish those raw edges all the way around. Here is my front bodice piece once again, and I'm going to use my front pattern piece to mark the dots that indicate where the pocket will be placed. Marking those dots on both sides. Now I'll place the wrong side of my pocket on the right side of my bodice, aligning all of the edges with my pin markings, and then pin the pocket in place. Then we're going to stitch the top, the sides, and the bottom edges of the pocket in place, edge stitching close to those folded edges, remembering to leave those slanted edges open, and back stitching at the beginning and end of your stitches. Place one yoke front and its corresponding yoke front facing right sides together along the shorter of the two vertical straight edges and pin in place, doing this for both sets. And then sew these seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Then we're going to trim these seams by about half. And then we're going to understitch the facings. We're going to open out this facing. This is the fabric that will be on the inside of the garment. We're going to open it over its seam allowance. Then we're going to edge stitch that facing to its seam allowance that's underneath, edge stitching close to that original seam line, doing this for both yoke front pieces. Now that those seams are understitched, and we have two mirrored yoke front sets, with each set wrong sides together, pin the bottom edge. And then we'll baste these bottom edges in place using about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Here is my front bodice piece once again with the right side facing me. I'm going to take those longer raw edges of one of the yoke pieces and pin them to one side of the front bodice, right sides together. The right side of your yoke front piece will be the side of the yoke that is not understitched. And pin in place along that straight edge. Doing the same for your opposite yoke piece on the other side. Now on both sides, we're going to stitch through all layers from the top of the yokes all the way to the dot marked from your pattern piece. This will be the same dot that we clipped to earlier when we reinforced those edges on the front bodice piece. Backstitching at the dots to secure. Now we're going to open out the yokes over their seams so that the right yoke lays on top of the left yoke when worn. Now that we have the bottom edge of that right yoke laying on top of the left yoke, we're going to fold back the top of the bodice right sides together so that now we have access to all of the bottom layers of that yoke area. Matching your notches, pin this area straight across through all layers. Noting that those clips that we made into the front bodice earlier will allow you to open out that seam allowance nicely along that bottom edge. Now we're going to take this section to the sewing machine and sew straight across, sewing from dot to dot, those same dots that we stopped our stitching at earlier, remembering to backstitch to secure. Now if your material doesn't fray, you could just leave these seams as they are. But to make all of those layers a little bit more compact, I'm going to take those edges of the yoke to my serger and serge them together. So I've turned my bodice over to the right side, and from the right side of the fabric, do that top stitching along the bodice side of the front bodice, just edge stitching close to that seam line, making sure that I'm catching that seam allowance underneath. Place your collar pieces right sides together, pin the outer edges and the unnotched edge, and then sew as pinned with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Then we can trim those seam allowances and turn the collar right side out, poking out the corners. And give the collar a good press. Here is the wrong side of my back bodice piece. I'm going to apply fusible seam binding to my shoulder edges. If you don't have fusible seam binding, you could use regular binding or a piece of ribbon and baste it to the wrong side of those shoulder edges for your back piece. This will stabilize those shoulders. Now I'm going to place my front and back pieces right sides together and then sew the shoulders with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Once the shoulders are sewn, you can stitch the edges if preferred. I'm going to be pressing the seams open. Now we can place the bottom raw edge of the collar right sides together with the bodice and start pinning in place at those center front edges. Then continue pinning around your neckline, matching your notches, and match the dots on the collar to the shoulder seams. Sew the collar to the neckline with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and then finish your edges. Now that that collar is attached and finished, you can press that seam allowance down toward the bodice, and then from the right side of the garment, you can top stitch that seam allowance down right below that collar seam that we just sewed, from center front all the way across to the opposite center front. Now we're going to top stitch this collar and yoke area from the top of the collar to the bottom of the yoke for both sides. We're going to be top stitching 1.5 inches from those side edges. Now I'm going to use my yoke front pattern piece to mark my button or snap placement on my front yoke. If you're choosing to sew buttons, your buttonholes will be sewn on the right yoke. I'm choosing to apply snaps. Once you've placed snaps or buttonholes into that right yoke, place the right yoke over the left to mark where you want your buttons and snaps to go on the other side, and then place your buttons and snaps on that left side. Now I'm going to place the front and back bodice right sides together and pin my side seams, pinning them on both sides. Then we're going to sew both side seams from the underarm to the bottom of the garment with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Then you can finish your seams if preferred. I'm going to be pressing them open. Fold your sleeve in half right sides together and pin the underarm seam. And do this for both sleeves. Sew those seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and finish if needed. Now with my bodice wrong side out and my sleeve right side out, I'm going to place my sleeve inside the bodice, aligning the underarm seams and pin in place. Then I'll match the notches on both sides that indicate front and back. And match the dot at the top of your sleeve with your shoulder seam and pin in place. And then continue pinning all the way around. And then I'll sew my sleeve into the armhole with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and finish the seams. And repeat on the opposite side to attach the other sleeve. Place your lower band pieces right sides together and pin the sides. Sew both sides with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Then fold this lower band in half the long way wrong sides together. And then we're going to place the band right sides together with the bottom of the garment and pin in place, first matching your side seams and your notches. And then continue pinning all the way around, noting that you will be stretching that band slightly to fit from point to point. Now I'm going to sew this band all the way around with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and finish the seams together. Now fold your sleeve cuff in half right sides together and pin the side seam. Repeat for both cuffs. Then sew those sides with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Then fold a cuff in half wrong sides together. Place the cuff right sides together with the bottom of the sleeve matching your seams and notches. And pin in place. Then we're going to sew the cuff to the bottom of the sleeve with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, once again stretching that cuff so that it fits the bottom of the sleeve perfectly. Repeat for both sleeves. Finish those seam allowances. And now your sweatshirt is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you check out the rest of my video library for more great sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.